Hey friends, I'm Otis Gibbs, and this is my buddy Susie Monick. She's going to tell you some great stories about Townes Van Zandt.
I first met Townes on Love Circle in Nashville, Tennessee. He came over to where I was living with Jimmy Gray, his bass player, and he came to the side door, and I had a cat, and the cat jumped on him and then jumped on a table, and Townes threw the whole table out the door. And that was how I first met him. And I was like, man. I moved to Nashville in 1976. So it was maybe around 78. You know, I got to see him rehearse, and I learned how to drink during the day because of him. and I also remember seeing him at Mississippi Whiskers. That was a club here in town that Don Schlitz played at, and I was sitting in with a girlfriend of mine named Pam Belford, and he was sitting at the end of a bar. It was real narrow, and he was sitting there, and he asked me, he said, what is Smokey the Bear's middle name? And I was like, I don't know. And he said, the. And that, I remember that was my first Townes joke. But, you know, I knew him, and he was with Cindy at the time, and it was pretty crazy times, and people, you know, the 70s were pretty wild, and the 80s got even wilder. He had a trio at the time. It was Jimmy Gray, Rooster Rowland, and a fiddle player named Cody. And actually, Cody pawned his Music Man amplifier, and Townes, like, put it in the pawn shop, and I got the pawn ticket from Townes and got the amp out and used it. So there was a connection, and I got to hear him play, but I also was a fly on the wall. I had my own bands, and we had an all-girl band. I played with different people, so I kind of, I got to play with him a little bit, but it wasn't like I would ever wanted to be in his band. It was a rough, gambling, drinking band. Harold Eggers was kind of their road manager, and so I had these suede leather pants, and Townes asked if he could borrow them for a gig, and he's really tall, and I'm really short, so they were really high water on him, but he wore the pants at some gigs, and then he fell in the mud. So when they came back from the tour and gave me the pants, they were all covered with mud, but... And he also taught me how to play Indian poker, where you put the cards on your forehead and guess. So, I got to see a lot of kind of after the gig drinking and gambling. And there was music, and there was a guy named Irving Kane who played a trombone, and Townes was kind of messing around with a fiddle. So we would have some weird, like different kind of jams. Like, Townes practiced with the guys, but if we jammed, he liked to have a different instrument he didn't know how to play, so he could just kind of get silly and mess around. He was fun to be around in the early days, but then later in life, he was just kind of really sad. And I also heard that he didn't really, I don't know how to say this, but he didn't really kind of welcome women so much in his music. He was like a man's man. And so a long time ago, he was doing an outdoor festival, and I did get to sit in on Old Shep. That was like the first time, to play a little mandolin or banjo, I forgot. But, the fact that I had dated guys who were in his band, I got to be one of the guys, which kind of got me a little more in that scene. Yeah, a lot of women liked him, and I've heard stories that in Texas, women, they wanted to be there with him when he died. I mean, he kind of had a big cult following, and but like I said, I was more of I drank and did drugs back in the day, so I would play cards with him. I'd gamble. I would do the non-musical things that kind of came after the gig. He once bet a cut of the cards on his gold tooth. And I remember with Mike Ewald, this friend of ours who's now passed away, but he was like a wild kind of Indian guy who would steal the tip jar. It was but he took Townes lost the cut of the cards, and they went out in the woods, and I think pulled the wrong tooth, is the way I hear the story. That so he was good on his bets, and he had a fringe suede jacket that I think he had gambled that for cut of the cards. So he would be good on his bets, but he lost, stuff. I don't really know what he won, but he was good on his losing. And I did play with Sergio. I played later in the 90s. I played with Richard Dobson, and Sergio was in the band. And we had played in Europe, and we did some shows, with Townes. And I heard that Townes would have to have doctors waiting when he got off the plane because he drank so many of the little liquor bottles. And we were on a plane ride with George Strait's band, and he wouldn't let them drink. So the stewardess gave us all the little liquor bottles. Sergio might remember this, and they said, well, while you're in Europe, it's expensive, and you can have all these little bottles, and we put them all on the bed and took a picture. That was before digital cameras, but it was like, we were like, man, we just got all these little airplane bottles of vodka. Yay. Yeah. He would play at the old Springwater, and he played at Douglas Corner. I was there for one of his last shows, as I hear it, or maybe next to last show or last show I know of. But when he played at Springwater, he would, and that was back in the days, the roof would be leaking. Like you had to have a gig when it wasn't raining out. But people like Old Crow Medicine Show and Guy Clark, and there was a circuit at the Springwater back, that's one of the oldest bars. But I remember, even back then, Townes would, he'd kind of forget the words to his old song. He'd go like, Pancho was a bandit. And then you could hear his wife going, Lefty, Lefty. And Lefty, you know what I mean? So he was tortured. He was a tortured soul of what I saw. He was fun loving, but saying a lot of us, I think had depression from too much drinking and drugs is just my own take on it, Yes, I have a recording of Townes, and I moved and took all my VHSs, and I donated a bunch to MTSU, but then there was like a handful of my favorites that I kept. And one is, and I digitalized it or DVD'd it. And one is Townes playing a benefit for a guy named Titus Alley. And it was recorded at Douglas Corner. And I hear it was one of his last gigs. And he started reciting a poem he wrote about Titus Alley. And we had a little backup band. I remember Michael Catalano was in it. I was on the banjo. I can't remember the other people, but it would be in the credits of this video. But Townes started reciting a poem and just broke down sobbing. And while we were playing the music, he was just kind of crying. It's a very emotional, video of him. And it was kind of not done of him specifically. It was all these different musicians tributing this songwriter friend who died, and he just happened to be one of the people on the bill. But it was a pretty emotional moment. And I know that actually the Smokey the Bear, what's his middle name story, I was down the street from Douglas Corner was a little antique shop. And I bought a little Smokey the Bear figurine, or Townes bought it. I'm not kind of sure, but he told me that joke with that bear again. He had a lot of time flies like an arrow, fruit flies like a banana. He had a lot of like these little jokes that he would tell.
What he tell us on stage in between songs?
Yeah, and he would tell them, to his friend. He was just kind of always. He was always on. He was, always kind of. He was always entertaining, but in a kind of a sad, Pierrot kind of way. He would come over to where I live because when I lived with Richard Dobson, I had a place in Belle Meade that I rented or owned and then owned. But Townes would leave his canoe there. And I remember him saying, this canoe, it's not like I'm giving it to you. The canoe belongs to nobody. We all just get to use it, So he would go canoeing with Richard a lot. And, so he'd come over. And
Where would they canoe?
on the Harpeth. Townes played on the road with, these guys. He traveled, and that's why he had a handler. That's why Harold Eggers was he needed someone to kind of take care of everybody. And so that's where he was. And then later, Janine, I got to know her through him, and he lived at her place. So on I think it was Town Park Drive, or it had the word Towns in it. So, so I knew him more going places. And the last memories of him, and these were pretty heavy, that was when Pinto Bennett lived in West Nashville in the Nations. And so I remember him at Pinto Bennett's house. And he had a little medicine bag he would carry with him. But he also did a lot of crying then in his last days. We would just be sitting around the table, and he would just start crying. And so those were hard times,
Do you remember the last time you saw Townes?
The last time was at Pinto Bennett's kitchen table, like saying, where he was just crying, and I was dating a guy at the time who lived like homeless under the bridge. I didn't know that at the time, but it was like he wanted to meet Townes, and it was kind of like introducing the alcoholic to the alcoholic. So it was kind of, like I said, it was weird times. There was just like a lot of sadness, and that was, so I just remember that being the last, and then the gig at Douglas Corner being sort of my next to the last seeing him. But I've known him through such a long period of time. That's why, he was a younger guy. I guess if you go from the 70s to whenever he died, was that 90? 90. So that's a long, if you do the math, that's a long period of time to know someone, and like saying as a friend, but not, again, when he was with women, I had my own boyfriend. So I wasn't like in that, I just got to see him as a band member kind of, or as the girlfriend of the guy in the band.
Did you go to his funeral?
Yes, I did. Yeah, it was like a lot of people who knew him, and I remember seeing Cindy there. She was, it was kind of, but I just kind of, it was just the passing of an era, and I just kind of stayed quiet. I didn't want to speak, and I wasn't like famous person to speak, but I saw a lot of people I knew there. And
where was it?
It was, it was a church on Music Row somewhere. I can't remember the name of it, but I remember, everybody being there, and I remember it being kind of like a who's who, and a lot of the people that were there, I kind of knew through the art world, because I did a lot of clay figurines of musicians. Actually, Guy Clark had bought a piece that was on his living room table, and so, he was there. I got to know him sort of through Townes, and Springwater was a bit, like Townes had friends who are famous and not famous, I guess. He just had a bunch of different people. Okay, I think he was a heartfelt writer. I think he did write from his heart, and he did like to have a good time. But like I said, I think there was an underlying sadness. A lot of people who are comedians, I worked with Robin Williams, and I had no idea that he was depressed. And so I think Townes, he brought all this joy to people, but he had a sadness. And I also heard stories that on trips where he'd travel, there would be young people try and keep up with him, like young guys wanted to hang with him and drink with him, and he would leave them in his wake. He would these people couldn't keep up with him, and so, and like I said, I had a good constitution back then myself, and I think we might have even done hard drugs together back then, but again, I had to quit everything so I could continue to live and tell these stories.
If you'd like to hear more Townes Van Zandt stories, click on the playlist in the upper right-hand corner of your screen and tell me down below what your favorite Townes Van Zandt song is, and I'll see you somewhere down the road. Much love to you.